Welcome to the Manly Saints Project with me, Hugh Hunter. If you enjoy my work, please consider signing up and supporting me on Substack, or click the link in the show notes to buy me a beer. And if you enjoy the podcast as audio or video, please consider giving me a rating wherever you are. It helps a lot. Now, let's meet this week's Manly Saint. Join me today to meet the gardener who became one of the most beloved of the ancient martyrs. Name: Phocas, Phocas the gardener. Life: unknown. Died at least before the end of the 4th century AD. Status: Saint. Feast: July 23rd, September 22nd. That night, after he had learned that he had to die, Phocas waited until his guests were asleep. He quietly slipped out of the house. Phocas had preparations to make. We know that he put his affairs in order. It is likely that he spent some time with a priest. The priest would have hurried off to alert the other Christians of Sinope, modern Sinop in southern Turkey on the coast of the Black Sea, of the terrible news. Another persecution was beginning. As for Phocas, he went back to his beloved garden, picked up a spade, and began to dig. Afterwards, the Christians of Sinope had trouble remembering when exactly Phocas had died. Unsure of when else it might have been, people often place Phocas in the persecutions of Diocletian. This missing information is unusual, and I wonder whether Phocas was hard to date because his death was out of sync with other persecutions, perhaps because it took place before the general persecution had begun. If so, this answer raises a second question. Why on earth would the spies of the Roman Empire go to all the trouble to single out a humble gardener? For a long time, the emperor's spies had borne the innocuous name of supply officers, the frumentarii. By the time of Diocletian, the frumentarii were so hated that Diocletian won some goodwill by shutting them down. Still, an empire needs its spies, and Diocletian had created a new group with an even more innocuous name, the agentes in rebus, which we might translate as people who do things in situations. The agentes must have tried to map out the network of Christians to find out who was important in the church. At the center of most networks, they would have found a priest or a bishop. But in the region of Sinope, they would have found something unusual. A layman's name came up again and again, connected to all sorts of people in and around the city: Phocas. The imperial spies knew that Phocas mattered, but they didn't know why he mattered. The answer to that question had to do with the place where Phocas happened to live. He lived just outside the walls of Sinope. Sinope had been founded by Amazons originally, as everyone knew, but since then it had passed to various kings and finally to Rome. War had caused fortification, and now Sinope was walled off from the land and fortified on the sea. Phocas was an ordinary man who happened to own a patch of land next to the road into Sinope, outside the city walls, but close to them. Travelers were always passing by, coming or going to the city. At some point, Phocas realized that God had put him in a location where he had an opportunity for a unique apostolate aimed at travelers. Phocas wasn't the first to see travelers as an opportunity, of course. Travel fueled entire industries. There were inns and relay stations and stores. People even built stone billboards along the side of the road, like the gigantic carved billboard in the south of modern Turkey that contained a summary of Epicurean philosophy, the key to a happy life, according to the rich man who financed it. Phocas's plans involved nothing so spectacular as setting up a giant philosophical billboard. he simply began to invite strangers on the last lap of their journey to spend the night in his home. Instead of trying to get admission to the city at night and then risking being robbed in the dark streets, travelers could get a good night's sleep and a meal from the fruits of Phocas's garden. And when the strangers asked Phocas why he offered this freely, he could speak to them about Christianity. Time passed. Perhaps some people thought that Phocas was a sucker for giving away what he had. Others, though, took note and tried to learn about Phocas's faith. The number of people who were brought to Christianity through their encounter with the generous gardener of Sinope grew. And so it seems that by the time the imperial spies tried to map out who was who in the city of Sinope, the name Phocas kept popping up. When the emperor decided to launch another persecution of Christians, it was obvious to his agents that the church in Sinope would be weakened without this Phocas, whoever he might be. Assassins were sent to Sinope to find Phocas and eliminate him. The assassins arrived outside Sinope as night fell. As they wondered if they should try to get into the city in the dark, a stranger invited them into his house. Without knowing it, the assassins had become guests of the man they had come to kill. We don't know what the assassins thought about their strange host. One possibility is that they may have thought he was a different sort of gardener, one of the few remaining Epicureans. A century before, when the Epicurean billboard had been built along the road, the philosophy of Epicurus was fashionable among Rome's upper classes. These days, Epicureanism was becoming unfashionable. Still, there were a few Epicureans left, and to an outside observer, Phocas would have seemed to live a very Epicurean life. After all, Epicurus, too, had been a gardener. The philosopher Epicurus has somehow gone through history with a reputation for teaching almost exactly the opposite of what he actually taught. The term Epicurean summons the idea of someone devoted to the pursuit of ever more refined forms of pleasure. In fact, Epicurus told his followers to stick to calm pleasures, the sorts of pleasures that don't leave you with a hangover or empty pockets or a broken heart. When other philosophers started schools, Epicurus bought a garden outside of Athens. He and his students worked the land and lived on the produce, enjoying the pleasure of rewarding work, healthy meals, and the company of friends. This humble life was part of Epicurus's answer to the question that troubled many philosophers, who wondered if there was a way to guarantee a man's happiness. Epicurus thought that happiness was possible in this life if one understood that the gods don't care what we do. Death isn't a bad thing. The good life is easy to find and suffering is easy to avoid. A big part of avoiding suffering was not bringing trouble down on yourself. Just as you could avoid a hangover by not getting drunk, you could avoid getting in trouble by cultivating your little private garden far from the centers of power and not getting mixed up in politics. That is why, to the assassins who had come to Sinope, the humble life of Phocas in his garden outside the city might have seemed like that of an Epicurean. As they were eating, Phocas asked his guests what had brought them to Sinope. They told him they were soldiers, come on a mission to find and kill a troublemaker. His name was Phocas. They asked their host if he knew this Phocas. Replying carefully, Phocas said that he knew the man they were looking for very well indeed, and then he offered to make the introduction, if only they would give him until morning. The assassins counted themselves doubly lucky to have gotten free bed and board and a lead on their target. That night, after they were asleep, Phocas slipped out of his house and began to make his preparations. In the morning, the assassins asked their host whether he knew where Phocas was hiding. Phocas calmly told them that Phocas was very close to them, that indeed he was none other than Phocas himself. The assassins were thunderstruck. In telling the story, people often assume that they were shamed by the generosity that Phocas had shown them. They probably were. But there was another problem as well. By accepting Phocas's hospitality, the soldiers had entered into a guest-host relationship. The myths of the pagans were full of stories of the terrible vengeance taken by the gods on those who violated this trust. You could trace the fall of Troy back to the behavior of an unruly guest. Perhaps under the circumstances, the assassins would have let Phocas leave if he wanted to. But if the gardener had intended to flee, he could have gone in the night. In this respect, Phocas was anything but an Epicurean. Epicurus did not believe in an afterlife. He ridiculed the views of his fellow Greeks who taught otherwise with their curious symbols of eternity, the bread and the wine. No, Epicurus said, when you die, you vanish like the flame of a candle that has been blown out. Epicurus argued that even so, death is not to be feared, since after death there can be no suffering or regret, as the person who might feel these things is no longer there. It would remain a popular argument, though, as philosophers seem to discover again and again, the argument is a lot more comforting when death seems far off. It is no surprise that as the Roman Empire entered the turbulent time we remember as the crisis of the 3rd century, Epicurean philosophy lost its popularity. But in a figure like that of Phocas the gardener, we find much of what was best about the Epicurean life. Phocas avoided dangerous entanglements and lived a moderate life among friends. He kept to himself and tended his own garden. The difference was that Phocas was not doing this for the sake of pleasure, but as quiet service to God. And so it was that when trouble arrived on his doorstep, despite how small and harmless he had made himself, Phocas was able to meet it with faith and courage. Phocas told the assassins that he was not afraid to die. If the assassins were worried about incurring punishment for killing their host, they could rest easy. He wasn't going to hold a grudge. Actually, Phocas welcomed the honor of martyrdom. His affairs were in order, and he was ready. When they went outside, the assassins found Phocas's final preparation. As the assassins had slept, Phocas had dug a grave for himself in his beloved garden. And so it was that the assassins of the emperor killed Phocas there. St. Phocas the gardener had died as quietly and considerately as he had lived. That makes it all the more interesting that St. Phocas is not exactly a quiet saint. Christians in the East told and retold his story and were inspired by his courage. They began to ask for his prayers, and they found help and healing. Unsurprisingly, he was soon a patron of gardeners and laborers and farmers. But Sinope was a port city, and even the sailors started asking for St. Phocas's help. They came back to port with strange tales of the saint's intervention, insisting that they had seen St. Phocas on deck during storms, or next to the helmsman to keep the ship out of danger. Soon, sailors had developed a special devotion to the saint. They began to keep St. Phocas's portion, setting aside a little grain with every meal to form a gift to the poor when they came back into port. Soon, it was said that Rome spoke of St. Peter and St. Paul, and of St. Phocas. St. Phocas was getting a reputation as a sort of Swiss Army knife of saints, a saint who did everything. Bishop Asterius of Amasea ticked off all the different gods pagans would have to placate for safety at sea, in agriculture, at work, when sick, or when trying to figure out what to do next. Instead of all this, as Bishop Asterius pointed out, they could accept that their life's path had brought them to a garden, and the generous gardener saint of Sinope was there and ready to help.